Hi, welcome to the Knitting Annie podcast. It is episode 11 and I'm recording already. I can't believe it either. Welcome to the show. If you found your way here, you know that I'm Knitting Annie. You are watching me through YouTube. If you are new to the podcast, welcome. And if you're a returning viewer, welcome. Thank you so much. I received many questions and comments the last episode, and thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it, and I appreciate all of your feedback, and it's an incredibly touching feeling to know that so many people have taken up spinning or something fiber related because of this podcast. So thank you. Thanks for watching. You can subscribe to my YouTube You can subscribe to my YouTube channel if you like, which I think gives you a little bit of an alert every time I update the podcast. And you can find me on Instagram as Knitting Annie. On Ravelry, I'm there less frequently as The Knitting Annie. And there's actually a very inactive Ravelry group for this podcast. You're more than welcome to join and be as active as you like. I'm not on Ravelry as much as I'm on everything else, but I will be visiting there occasionally, and if I can't get my website back up and running by the time this is over, I may just post the show notes on Ravelry in the group instead of doing it on the website. Is that mostly how people do it anyway? I usually don't have to refer back to the show notes for the podcast that I watch, but I don't know. What would be easier for you guys? Would you rather see it on a different website, or would you rather see it on Ravelry? You tell me. I'm curious. I have so many questions that I'm not going to be able to get to all the answers today, but that's great because I'll have material for some of the next podcasts, so thank you very much. So I'm going to show you today a couple of the things I'm working on as far as knitting. I'm going to show you a finished object. Very exciting. I'll show you some spinning that I'm working on. I'll answer a couple of these questions. It's kind of interesting to me the way this podcast has progressed, because initially this was the Knitting Annie podcast and not really the Spinning Annie podcast, but it just happened. So part of me is a little bit confused, so I don't know whether or not to focus so much on spinning or knitting or both or what, or if I focus sometimes on spinning and sometimes on knitting, if different people will get, I don't know, bored with it if you've come to expect me as a spinning podcast and then all of a sudden I'm talking about knitting. But it's a work in progress, so if you have any opinions, I'd be happy to hear them. Oh, I'm so fidgety. Sorry if I'm moving around so much. Also, I got a little happy with my new eyeliner. So you can see there's a lot there. Yeah, that's a lot of eyeliner. Anyway, I think it looks less on camera probably than it does in person, so that's fine. So where should I start? Let's start with a finished object because that's exciting. I've been off from work for a few days, and on Saturday I thought I would knit the free yarn that I got from the yarn crawl I was telling you guys about last week, and it's Malabrigo worsted, which is a single ply yarn. Malabrigo also makes a worsted yarn. I think I forgot to bring one of them in with me. Sorry. So I got this from a yarn shop in Connecticut called Knit and Pearls, but pearls is spelled like the jewelry, not like the knitting. And it's in Avon, Connecticut, and they were part of the yarn crawl, the Connecticut yarn crawl that I participated in a few weeks back. And I won this really pretty skein of Malabrigo, and it's this orange color. And I made this gargantuan hat. It's huge. So this is the barley pattern, and I don't know how well this picture is going to translate for you there, but see how this lady's wearing it and the baby's wearing it. It's not that big, and she has it kind of a little bit back on her head, and the brim is probably not as long as I did mine. And then if you see their little family here, kind of a slouchy hat. So I measured Brad's head, and I got 24 inches, which would be the largest size So I cast on 96 stitches. I won't tell you the whole pattern. It is a free pattern though. It's called Barley. It's by Tin Can Knits. And apparently there's a whole series of free patterns in this. Wheat scarf, malt blanket, barley hat, oats cowl. You get where she's going with that. So anyway, the pattern came with the yarn. So I thought, what better than to make the hat? And I didn't swatch because I never swatch. I'm one of those people. And it's huge. So Brad did not like it because it was too big. I love the color. I'll put it on so you can see it. And you can see how it comes together in the end, kind of like in this spiral decrease. I love how squishy this part is. With the garter there. But it's kind of big. Before I blocked it, it was big, and then after I blocked it, I was like, oh man. But I knit this in one day. I did this all on Saturday. For those of you who follow me on Instagram, you saw that I posted a picture of me wearing this hat, holding a very handsome silky rooster. That belongs to my mother-in-law. So yeah, it's big. Too big for Brad. I don't really mind it for me, but I wish it was a little bit smaller. So then today I had the bright idea of driving back to Knit and Pearls to try and get that same yarn in another color for Brad and make it smaller. But come to find out, they don't actually carry that Malabrigo worsted. They carry the one that is a 2-ply. And of course I had to buy one skein of that. So much for a yarn diet. Oh wait, I do have it, I think. I do. It's coming up much more navy on the screen, but in person it's a very intense dark cobalt blue. And this is Malabrigo Rio, 210 yards. Do they name their colorways? Azul Profundo. But I thought I would try that with the barley hat. And I got this amazing ball. I'm trying to get the ball band. This amazing ball of Trendsetter Yarns Duchess, 64% wool, 30% cashmere, 6% polyamide. And it's a 50-gram ball. Whoa, it is so soft. It wasn't inexpensive. I think it was like $23. That's a lot of money. $26? It's a lot. But when I tell you, it's like you went outside on a really beautiful day, you caught a cloud with your hands and rolled it up into a ball so I could make it into yarn. That's what it feels like. And it looks like it's some sort of a chain ply. Can you see that? Well, in any event, I cast on 2 sizes smaller than the one that I just made. This yarn is knitting up slightly thicker, and I'm staying on the smaller needles, which is, I think, a 6, because I think the pattern calls for a 6 and a 7. I will tell you in case you plan on knitting it. No, a 6 and an 8. So in the last hat, the orange one that I made, I cast on using a size 6 and then I went up to the 8. In this case, I'm staying with the 6 because I anticipate this growing after I block it. And Brad likes to wear a tighter fitting hat. It knits up so nice. I wish you guys could feel this. And then there's the garter side. Very easy pattern. I totally recommend it. It's great for the car. So yeah, that's one of my finished objects and a work in progress. And then yesterday I knit the majority of this sock. I had the cuff done there's no pattern. I'm just doing a plain sock. So I'm doing a 2x2 rib and then just knitting straight. I decided to do a gusset and a heel flap, which I don't normally do. I normally do an afterthought heel, but I like to mix it up once in a while to keep things interesting. So that's just a slip stitch heel. And I think that's a heel flap, a slip stitch heel flap. I think that's a square heel or a German heel. I don't know. Yeah, and I'm doing this on my 9-inch Chiogu circulars, which is my preferred method, but I did do the heel flap on DPNs. And this yarn, I'm keeping this in my bag from that store I was telling you about from Kent, Connecticut, Black Sheep Yarns. And this is Regia. I don't know what series this is or what you would call it. It's so funny. This isn't that old. This came out fairly recently. And I was on Instagram yesterday and I was knitting socks in the car and I decided to put them down for a second and I pulled up Instagram and there's a woman who's knitting socks in her car and I'm like, oh, that's funny, I'm doing that too. And then I decided to go back through her feed and she had just knit a pair of socks using this. So I'm like, wow, that's so weird. What are the odds that that would have happened? But I guess pretty good when all of the people you follow are knitting people. Yeah, so I've seen this particular yarn and this particular colorway on Instagram a lot lately. I like it. I hope that I didn't make the leg part too long. For some reason that seems long to me. I don't want to run out of yarn. That's a work in progress. And I think that's pretty much it on the knitting front. I didn't work on my sweater at all. I don't know when I'm going to pick that up again. I don't particularly love the yarn. It's a single, and I think it's going to pill like crazy and shed like crazy, but it's really soft and it's really pretty. So that's that. You may notice behind me there's some yarn. That's some of my hand spun yarn. And I kind of did that on a whim today. It made me feel good to see it behind me. But then it made me realize that a couple different projects I want to make with what's there. And I'm trying to think, when we move, how will I want to set up my fibery room to make it most conducive to spinning and knitting and talking to you guys. So I'm playing with a couple different ideas. It's kind of exciting. So I have a bunch of questions written down. And I'm trying to think of which we're going to talk about now. I know one for sure. Susan, hi. I follow Susan on Instagram, and I know she follows a lot of you guys. Her name on there is SMoorecT, S-M-O-O-R-E-C-T. She's also in Connecticut. And she asks, where do I get my fleeces from? And I guess a better question might be, where don't I get my fleeces from? Because I have a bit of a fleece problem, as you guys know. So when I first started spinning, I don't know, there was like this fear that I was going to run out of fiber. I enjoyed it so much that I started running through it really quickly. And then I realized, man, I'm going to be spending a lot of money on fiber. So I tried to think of the most cost-effective way to process my own fiber and get my own fleeces. So I went to Craigslist. And I started searching in the farm and garden section, and I came across a couple of people that were selling fleece there, and then I decided to make a post saying, does anyone have any extra sheep fleece they're not going to do anything with that I can have? And a few hobbyists contacted me and said, yeah, I have some wool. It's not the prettiest wool in the world, and you can have it. So that's how I got my first fleeces. I will say that probably 20% of it was usable, and the rest was not really that great and ended up in a compost pile. But I guess it was good to learn on or to have, so I didn't feel like, you know, I was ruining other things by processing them the wrong way. I don't know that I would do that again if I could go back. And I didn't have professional hand cards. I was using dog slicker brushes, which are a great tool to have as flickers to open up locks before you use professional hand cards or hand combs, but really not smart to do on their own because it's just not as good. And you'll get frustrated, you'll hurt your hands and your wrists by doing all of these small movements with these, you know, tools that really aren't the best. It's kind of like trying to write an essay with a really dull pencil. So my best advice would be to get some proper hand cards and hand combs if you're going to go out there and buy some fleeces. But anyway, I'm getting off on a tangent. So then I joined some Facebook groups for fleece. There's quite a few of them out there: raw fleece, washed fleece, and I got some fleeces from there. I get some from local festivals like the Connecticut Sheep and Wool Festival. Later on, I want to say in November, there's the one up in Massachusetts where the Big E is. That's also a really good show, and I get them there. So when I first started going to these shows, I didn't realize that the fleeces were for sale. I thought that they were just for judging and for show, but there'll be many, many tables with these big garbage bags full of fleeces, and you could buy those. So I try and get there before everybody else does. And I told you guys the story about the last show where I was able to get in a lot earlier than everybody else. And I like to go through and pick through each fleece and see what I really like and buy them in person, because then I can really tell the quality. I also go online and check out the different sheep breeder associations in everybody's state, and I can see who is breeding Jacob sheep, who is breeding Romney sheep, and I'll go to their websites, I'll check out their pictures, and I'll contact them and see what they have for sale. A lot of farmers that grow fleeces for hand spinning post them on their website, so you can see the staple length, the weight of them. Other good things to ask: were they professionally sheared? Does it have a lot of second cuts? Has the fleece been, why am I drawing a blank? Has the fleece been skirted? Meaning, is all the neck wool gone? Is all of the breech wool gone? The leg wool, is that all gone? And are you left with the blanket? Or are you also paying for the weight of that? Because if so, you might want to pay less because you're going to lose some weight from there. I also, where else do I get? Oh, there's a group on Ravelry where you can buy raw wool. But I'm really particular now. The longer I've been doing this, the more I realize I don't want to struggle with fleeces that haven't been cared for properly from a grower. You want fleece that comes from healthy sheep, because sheep that are not healthy or are not bred properly, all of that will be reflected in their fiber. So the fiber could be brittle. The fiber could have the wrong type of crimp for that breed. It could have a high lanolin content when that breed necessarily or usually has a lower lanolin content. So all of these different things will play a role, and I think it's mainly trial and error as far as a lot of this stuff is concerned. But I think that another good thing to do would be to know, okay, do you like spinning something more coarse, something more fine, refining that to which breed you might like, and then focusing on the best of that breed. So if you're going to be buying a Jacob fleece from somebody, or a Romney fleece from somebody, or a BFL fleece, let's try and find you a really great breeder who's going to have something that's a really phenomenal representation of that breed. Because you may not realize that you would like Romney, because maybe the Romney that you've purchased or spun in the past has come from a sheep that's not a good representative of that breed, and it's much nicer than you think. I think sometimes spinners think that Romney is really coarse, but you can get some really beautiful, beautiful, beautiful Romney fleeces, and I happen to be spinning one right now. So I hope that that answers the question. I can talk more if you guys want about actual breeders and actual growers of fleece that I like to go to time and again. There have been a couple farmers where I go back and ask for that particular animal's fleece the following year because it was so nice the first year that I got it. There are some very, very reputable breeders out there, reputable farmers. A lot of the fleece I buy comes from coated sheep, which means the sheep actually wears a coat year-round, and as the sheep grows and his, well, if it is a growing sheep, maybe it's full size already, but as the sheep's wool gets longer throughout the growing season, they actually have to change the coat. So the coats themselves are expensive, and the process of maintaining their fleece by way of changing these coats all the time is labor intensive. So those fleeces in the end will be more pristine. They'll have less veggie matter, they'll have less dirt, they'll be very intact. So those will go for a premium. But like I said, why waste time with fleece that you really have to fight with just because you got a good deal? Generally, if you're buying a full fleece anyway, it is a good deal if you're going to process it yourself. So I'm happy to give you guys some names and advice and things like that too. If you have specific questions about that, or buying a fleece, what to look for, we can go over that too. Andrea, who is the cat lady, hello. She is the cat lady, which is the cat with 2 T's and then lady. She has her own podcast, and I'm going to check that out later today. I haven't seen it yet, but she mentioned to me on Instagram that she was going to make one and say hello. So hello, thank you for watching. And she asks, how do I wash my fleeces? Hers are always slightly oily. So, excuse me. I brought some of the things I use to wash fleeces, and I'll tell you a little bit about what I have done washing fleeces. And I think that when people first start, a lot of people will use Dawn dishwashing liquid, and that's great. If I run out of everything else that I like to use, Dawn is my next choice. Dawn is a grease cutter. It's a very good grease cutter. I've tried using other dishwashing detergents and they just don't work as well. But it's specifically the blue Dawn. And I've tried both the concentrated and the unconcentrated version. Is it called unconcentrated when it's not concentrated? The regular version and the concentrated version. I like the concentrated better because I find with the regular you have to use a lot more to have the same result. I don't prefer using Dawn because I think it actually removes too much of the oil. And Andrea had mentioned that if you compare what she's washing to a commercially prepared fleece, hers is much more oily than that fleece. And I think there's a couple different reasons that would be, but I actually prefer it to be a little bit oily. And I had seen a video a while back when I first started spinning about a lady that prepares her long draw by actually spraying a little bit of olive oil on the bats or the Rolags that she uses. And she was talking about historically how that was done. And I don't know the story behind that or the accuracy or anything, and I'm gonna do a little bit more research. But what I find is I want a little bit of that grease left over. I don't want it to be tacky so that it feels like tape, you know what I mean? That kind of tacky feeling. But I do want it to be a little bit slippery, and I think that heat plays a big role into it, and I think that's why commercially prepared things, not only because they're using a stronger soap probably, but they heat things very hot. And there was a bit of a debate in one of the Facebook groups yesterday because for some god-awful reason, fiber people love to debate facts and information. So that being said, I hope you all understand, I'm really not an expert. You guys are lovely and ask me so many questions and seem to enjoy my explanations, but I am definitely not an expert. I haven't been doing this for 20 years. You know, I don't do it for a living, so feel free to check all of the information I give you against your own sources. But there was a bit of a debate in one of the groups because someone said that lanolin melted at 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and then another guy was like, no, it's 100 degrees Fahrenheit, and then someone else was like, I own a fiber mill and it's 180 degrees, so it was really funny to me. The bottom line is the water has to be really hot to get the lanolin, which is a grease, off of the fleece. So I think that would be my biggest tip. Isn't necessarily get better soap, but make sure your water is really hot and start with the really hot water in the beginning because you want to make sure you get it off at that point. Although, you know, sometimes I'll soak a fleece overnight in cold water just to get some of the dirt off, or if it's got very gummy tips that I want to loosen that first. So rule of thumb when you're washing really anything wool, so this can go for a blocked finished garment as well as fiber, is that you don't ever want to go from hot to cold unless you're doing something intentionally to full it or felt it or something. But if you don't want it to felt, you're going to go from hot to hotter to hottest kind of a thing. So when I'm washing my wool, and I hope I'm not going too many different directions at once, but let's start somewhere. There's a few different ways, and if you look on YouTube, there's a couple really great videos. The lady that washes it in a top-loading washing machine, I've done that before. If I had a top-loading washing machine here, I'd probably still be doing it that way, except I would be using these garment bags. She shows the video where the fiber is loose, and while that will work, I don't want to make it harder for me to take things out of that washing machine that gets stuck to the drum, and I don't want little particles of hair or things going into the washing machine and then eventually gunking things up, and then I have to deal with that. So I would probably still use these just to keep things a little bit more contained. But this is a garment bag. I probably got this at Bed Bath & Beyond, I don't know. And I have two different kinds. This one is a little bit more stiff, and I think over the long run this will probably hold up better. And this one is just a little bit more pliant. But I stuff the bag with fleece, and then if it's a particularly dirty fleece, I'll soak it overnight in cold water with nothing. No detergents at all, no soaps, no nothing. And then the next day, I'll pull this bag out of the, well, I'll show you. So this is one of the buckets that I use. I got this at PetSmart because I used to use it for one of my fish tanks. So I'll fill this with cold water overnight. If it's a really gummy fleece, this will be filled with fleece, and it just goes in here with that. Then the next day, or 2 days later, or however long you feel like soaking it, I pull the bag out and I let it drain for a second. And then I have this. I have a few pots like this. This is stainless steel because I also sometimes dye in this, and you should dye in stainless steel instead of aluminum. And I have this strainer, which is for, there's actually still some water in there, steaming vegetables. So that usually sits on the top. And what I do is I take the bag out with the dripping fleece, and I sit it, oh, this is so loud. I sit it in here for a second just to let it, you know, drain a little bit further. And then I fill the other bucket again with very hot water. So as hot as my bathtub will allow. I'm doing this while I'm in the bathtub in case I get anything that spills over. And the water is so hot that you can't keep your hand in the water. It's too hot to have your fingers in, too hot to have your hands in. So we have a setting on our water heater that I made higher to make sure it was hotter. You just have to be really careful because if you have little children in the house, you don't want to keep that water temperature high because God forbid they go and turn the hot water on. They could burn themselves, but we don't have kids. So, and I don't have to worry about Watson using the sink because he doesn't like to take baths usually. So yeah, I make that really hot, and then I take this now soaking wet fleece and I stick it in the hot water. You don't have to worry from going from super cold to super hot because that's not going to make it felt. It'll make it felt though if you take it from super hot and you put it into cooler water. So then I let that sit for about a half an hour with a soap in there. And that soap that I prefer to use is Unicorn. This is Unicorn Power Scour, and I also use Unicorn Fiber Rinse. So Power Scour cleans raw fleeces to make them not greasy anymore. So I'll put a few pumps in that bucket, and I'll set that in there in the really hot water, let it sit for half an hour. When you come back to it, the water looks like a very dark chocolate milk, and I pull the fleece out again, let it drain on that drainer again, dump the bucket with the dirty water, fill it again with hot water. And it's okay that the fleece has cooled a little bit now on its own, and then you put it back into hot water. So you always want to make sure the next water that you're putting it into is hotter than the fleece is currently, or at least the same temperature, because you don't want it to felt. And I have had in my history of washing fleeces very few incidents of anything felting, including alpaca, which felts really easily. But if you just stick to that rule, it's not bad. And hot water is the key. Using the right soap is the key. I really can't say enough about this stuff. I've tried pretty much everything else. There's a couple new things out there. Every time a new thing comes out, I try it just to see if it's good. But really, I find the Power Scour to be the best, and I like the smell of it a lot. So, at some point, I may think to be a dealer for them. I like it so much. I don't know. There's a lot of people that sell it, and you can buy it directly from them too. But I really do like it, and I need to buy more at a time. I think this is the 16-ounce bottle. It comes with this pump, but I should probably buy a gallon at a time. So then, after it is washed and the water pretty much runs clear, which for me is usually after the third rinse, I squeeze out the water and I lay it between a couple old bath towels and I press it, and then it's relatively dry, and then I have racks in here and I just spread it out on the racks and I lay it dry in the racks. I used to dry my fleeces outside. I can't really do that here. It's just weird with my neighbors and everything, and you know, I don't want them to think I'm crazier than I already am. But part of drying outside that makes me nervous is that I don't want to attract moths that are going to want to eat the wool. So for me, it's kind of like a paranoia thing that if I do it in here, I won't have any problems. So this is some of the Black Romney that I've showed you guys before. I have 8 pounds of it, and it came from the same person in Connecticut. And I kind of want to contact her to see if she has a picture of this ewe, because I love this fleece. It's a fairly long staple length. And what is that, 7 inches? And when you stretch it out, obviously it's even longer. But when you're talking about buying for staple length, it's the unstretched length that they're giving you. But if I stretch it out, it's even longer. It is so beautiful. It pulls apart really easily. The tips come off a little bit. So see how that is like sun tip there? So this wasn't a coated sheep. Otherwise the tips wouldn't be as sunburnt as they are. And them being sunburnt makes them a little bit brittle, kind of like our own hair. So what I've been doing on the ones that are particularly bleached, I'll go in the front and I'll pull off the tip. If you are, and there's a little bit of it there, hard to see. If you are hand combing this or hand carding this, it would help to use one of these dog slickers to flick it first. Or if you have a flicker, it's basically a mini version of this, and you hold it really taut and you flick it like that on the ends, and it'll get the brittle tips off where it is fairly brittle. And then if you do the other side, if there's a second cut there, this will take the second cut with it. So then all you're left with is that really pretty same length lock. And of course you could spin directly from this if you want. You can hold it from the middle and spin from the fold, or you can kind of draw it out a little bit and then spin it like that. Very easy. But what I've been doing is carding them by hand with my hand cards. And last night I came to see if this was dry, because it's been sitting in this room for a couple days now, but there's a lot of it. I've washed half the fleece already. It's not fully dry, but I'm like, well, let's play with some of it anyway. So I took some of it and I hand picked it and I did it on the hand cards. I made a couple roll-ags and I ran into the living room, and you know that feeling that you get if you're playing like a card game and you know you've got a really good hand and nobody knows yet but you? So that like squee feeling in your stomach. Do you guys get like that ever with fiber or yarn? Like if you're in the yarn shop and you grab a ball of yarn and it's like really amazing and you're like, that's kind of how I felt with this last night and making these little roll-ags. So I kept running back and forth from this room into the living room with my wheel, and I have my Lewitt wheel here. I hope that you guys can see the yarn. It's so dark it might not show up. But I did almost half a bobbin, I think. Yeah, you can kind of see that. It's a lot thicker than what I normally spin. And if we let this kind of ply against itself, that's going to be a pretty good weight yarn. And I guess I'm spinning it semi-worsted or semi-woolen, so it's kind of a combination of both techniques. Someone asked, actually a couple people, if I could take a video of me spinning woolen, and I will at some point, but again, I'm no expert, so I might not be doing it technically the same way that, you know, a real expert would, but it gets the job done, so I'll be happy to show you guys that video if I can set that up. But anyway, this is a fairly dense yarn, and I think that the first thing I will make is another hat. I'm on a hat kick, can you tell? Okay, let's see what else. There are a lot of good questions, none of which I will continue answering in this podcast because I've already gone, gosh, over half an hour and I'm just kind of rambling along. So, oh, you know what? I'll show you that finished yarn from what I was spinning the last time I podcasted. Oh, this is the yarn that I showed you in the last episode. This is it after it's been washed. It really plumped up. It's so great and squishy. Ugh, isn't it so pretty? It's so soft that it almost feels like it would fall apart if I pulled on it, although I know it won't. It's just so delicate feeling for being such a thick yarn. So pretty. I love all of the little tweedy bits. I think you can see the tweed a lot easier in person. And there's a lot of sparkle in here that you really can't see in this light, but very sparkly. So that is one yarn. Who needs to knit anything? Just wear your yarn out in the world. And this is the other yarn. I think this came out really great. It's so funny though, because I tend to prefer a woolier, fluffier, more raw looking hand spun yarn, but this is really quite nice too. And another funny topic that came up on Facebook the other day, and then a couple knitting bloggers talked about it, and one of them was like, oh, I don't even want to talk about it because it's so controversial, but whether or not hand spun should look hand spun, or whether or not hand spun should look like someone actually spun it. And it's an interesting topic because so many people, when they are spinning, they're spinning for this perfection where you can't tell that it was a human that did it. And I think I'm somewhere down the middle where I'll try for both. But anyway, this one came out a little bit more perfect than the one that I'm wearing now. But I'll hold that up. It's a much thinner yarn. This is probably a light fingering weight. And I bought this from the Connecticut Sheep and Wool Festival. What's that lady's name? Hold please. She also made this bat that I showed you guys last time. Fat Cat Knits. I think she was at Rhinebeck this year. For those of you that went, did anyone buy anything from her? She made this top, and I bought it with the intention of spinning sock yarn, and then I forgot that's why I bought it when I started spinning. Although I feel like I needed more weight because this isn't going to be enough to make a regular pair of socks. So I should have purchased two braids of the fiber. But I bought this because it has nylon in it. So it's Blueface Leicester, mohair, which is also very strong for socks, and nylon. It's pretty much fractal spun. So what I did was I divided the braid in half, and then with one half I divided it even further, probably into eighths, and I spun that as a single on one bobbin. And then on the other bobbin I took the other half of the braid and I spun it from one end to the other so that the variation in the colors was exactly how it looked on the original braid, and that didn't repeat itself. It was straight all the way through. Whereas the other bobbin has the repeat. So it repeated 8 times or 6 times or whatever. I wasn't as particular with it. And what that'll do with this resulting yarn, and you can kind of see that now because there are these stripes, it will make striping variation in the finished garment. So I might have enough yardage here to make something like the Rose City Rollers, the short socks, but I won't be able to make a full pair. I didn't count the yardage. But either way, I will show you guys what this turns out like when I knit with it. I love it so much. This yarn has no halo to it, really. And this is washed, I said it. I wish that would focus better. So pretty. I love the colors. And lately, the stuff that I've been buying has been bleeding quite a bit when I go to do my rinsing. And like I said in the last podcast, I'm not too worried. But what I wanted to tell you, which we didn't really talk about last time, what happens if you buy yarn in your yarn shop, or if you buy fiber from somebody and you can't get it to stop bleeding? What would you do with it? And I'll tell you what I would do with it. So the first thing I would do, if it was somebody like Malabrigo or a bigger company or whomever, even the smaller guys, I would write them a very kind email letting them know that I love their product, but this is what has happened. Now, you really should be thinking about that before you knit your item, because I've seen several people who've made beautiful two-color shawls, and one of the darker colors upon blocking will bleed into the lighter color, which really stinks. So usually, if I'm doing something like that, I'll wash the skeins first and hang them to dry before knitting with them, because you don't want it to bleed. Okay, I would contact the person and I would let them know that this has happened. I would say 9 times out of 10, the vendor or the dyer or whomever will want to send you a new skein. Personally, I've never had to send anything back to anybody. I've contacted, I think, 2 or 3 people in the course of me knitting or spinning, and I said, listen, I love the fiber, but I can't get it to stop bleeding. I'm going to try and set it. What would you like me to do? I thought you should know, so that, maybe they would fix it or change their dyeing methods. A lot of the bigger yarn companies will reimburse you and they'll send you more yarn, or the yarn shop would take it back and give you more yarn. People are generally very accommodating, because if you ever dyed anything yourself, you know how difficult it can be to set certain colors. Or you may be rinsing it and think that it runs clear, and then someone at their own home decides to run it in very hot water for some reason. A lot of dyers will also tell you to excuse me, block the garment, or to set your yarn in lukewarm water or something very mild that you would normally wash a garment like that in. Personally, I'm a little bit more rough with things, and I want to see if I can get any of it to bleed, so I usually wash things in hotter water, because I want to make sure that when I'm wearing it, it's not going to come off on me, or if I gift it, it would be so embarrassing for me to give like a hat to somebody and then they take the hat off and their whole forehead's blue. So I try and make sure any excess dye is gone. But if you get something and they are reimbursing you and you're trying to salvage what you've already knit or whatever, what you can do is rinse it several times. And like we were talking about before, you never want to go from cold to, or from hot to cold. You want to go from cold to hot, because you don't want to felt the item that you're using. So what I would do is rinse this several times. So just like when blocking a garment, you have your bowl of water, you set it in there, you see what happens to the water, and so on. This unicorn fiber rinse is what I use to block all of my knitting things. It's basically like a conditioner. So I will use this also when I'm washing fleeces to make it nice and soft after I've washed it. I'll do that for my yarn when I'm setting my twist. I'll use the fiber rinse. So I'll do that several times in the water, and I'll try and see how clear I can get it to run. So for instance, this, I had to soak this like 3 times to get the water to stop being this orangey pink color. If I couldn't get it to stop, I would then go to my stove with one of my pots of plain water. I'd heat it up to about simmering, and I'd put in either some white vinegar. If you're using like a half of a spaghetti pot, I would put in maybe a half a cup of white vinegar. If you don't mind, put in more. It's not going to hurt anything. If you don't have vinegar and you happen to have citric acid, that's even better in my opinion, because it has no odor and you don't have to worry about getting the smell out later. But you need this acid in there sometimes to allow the rest of the dye to fix itself to that fiber. This is a little bit different if you're using something that is not animal-based. Most of us are using wool. I mean, it's not like you're buying cotton and then you're finding that it bleeds. Although, you might. But if it's an animal-based fiber, that's what you would go about doing. You would try and set it again afterwards. Then you would take it out of there. You could rinse it again in the same temperature simmering water, and try and get the rest of it to absorb into the yarn. What I've also done, I had this beautiful yarn that I couldn't get to stop running blue. So I sat it in my pot. I put it in simmering water. You don't want it to be really bubbly because the agitation too can affect the felting of the wool or the yarn. But then I got some raw white wool that I had to try and be like a dye catcher. So I had that in there with my citric acid, and I put in a handful of raw white fleece, and it was washed. And that helped to absorb some of that blue dye. And the blue dye actually then, because I had my citric acid in there, it fixed itself to the fiber that I had in there, and it gave a place for that dye to go. Wow, I really feel like I'm rambling a lot in this episode. For some reason though, you like watching, so thank you. I don't understand it, I don't get it, but thank you. So that's me talking about where I get my fleeces from, how I wash my fleeces. We talked a little bit about spinning, we talked a little bit about knitting. If there's anything specific you want answers to, please feel free to reach out. If you have any suggestions for me about ways I could improve the podcast or make it more enjoyable for you, please let me know. Thank you to those of you who've asked questions from the last show. I am going to go over them. Little by little, we'll go down that list, and I will explain a few other things to you guys. But if you have any other questions, comments, you just want to say hello, please feel free to find me. Yeah. So thank you. Thank you very much for watching. I appreciate it. Bye.